Hey guys, tonight we begin with the surprisingly busy and occasionally ridiculous life of Paleolithic humans. What did cavemen actually do all day turns out? It wasn't just rock smashing and fire discovery montages. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background. And let us ease into tonight's journey together. The average day for a caveman began at dawn, or slightly before, depending on how loud the wind was, or whether someone nearby started coughing again. Most people slept on animal hides, or directly on packed earth, sometimes with a layer of dried grass or leaves for padding. You probably slept near a fire, not for ambience, for heat, and to keep insects and predators away. Sleeping away from the group wasn't really an option, unless you wanted to wake up missing a foot. Most people slept in small, tight groups, families, extended families, and whoever else was part of. The local band privacy didn't exist, everyone heard. Everything. The first thing you did after waking up was check the fire. If it went out, someone had to restart it. It could take time, patience, and a lot of rubbing sticks together. To get food, defend yourself, or process meat and hide. Some people in the group were better at this than others, and it was unusual to borrow gear from someone more skilled, though they probably expected something in return. Children were usually the first to make noise. They'd start moving around, looking for something to eat or something to do. Often both adults would slowly get up and begin preparing for the day. They could mean gathering water, checking nearby traps, or heading out to look for signs of animal movement. No one eased into the day. There was no time for that. Your daily goal was simple: stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up in one piece, your fire was still burning, and nothing outside looked immediately dangerous. You were already ahead. Fire not for ambience, for heat, and to keep insects and predators away. Sleeping away from the group wasn't really an option, unless you wanted to wake up missing a foot. Most people slept in small, tight groups, families. Extended families and whoever else was part of the local band privacy didn't exist. Everyone heard everything. The first thing you did after waking up was check the fire. If it went out, someone had to restart it. That could take time, patience, and a lot of rubbing sticks together. If it was cold out, which depending on the season it often was, everyone would be cranky until it came back to life. Next, you might look over your tools and weapon, spears, knives, scrapers, anything that could be used for hunting or protection. These had to be kept in good condition. Losing your tools meant losing your ability to get food, defend yourself, or process meat and hides. Some people in the group were better at this than others, and it was unusual to borrow gear from someone more skilled, though they probably expected something in return. Children were usually the first to make noise. They'd start moving around, looking for something to eat or something to do. Often, both adults would slowly get up and begin preparing for the day. They could mean gathering water, checking nearby traps, or heading out to look for signs of animal movement. No one eased into the day. There was no time for that. Your daily goal was simple: stay warm, find food, and avoid injury. If you woke up in one piece, your fire was still burning, and nothing outside looked immediately dangerous. You were already ahead. In the Paleolithic era, personal hygiene existed, just not in the way we think of it today. Cleanliness was mostly practical, not aesthetic. You cleaned yourself when it started interfering with your ability to live, or when the smell became a group issue. Bathing happened, but it depended heavily on the season and environment. If there was a stream, people washed in it when the water was in freezing. Otherwise, cleaning might involve wiping off dirt with leaves, handfuls of sand, or on rare luxury occasions, animal fat. It's azrite fat could be used to scrub the skin, which sounds odd until you realize it also helped with warmth, and insect control. Teeth were another story. There were no toothbrushes, but some people chewed fibrous sticks or bones to clean. Their teeth dental wear was common, especially since the Paleolithic diet involved tough meat, unprocessed grains, and sand particles from grinding stones. It got into food cavemen in the Paleolithic era. Personal hygiene existed, just not in the way we think of it today. Cleanliness was mostly practical, not aesthetic. You cleaned yourself. When it started interfering with your ability to live, or when the smell became a group issue, bathing happened, but it depended heavily on the season and environment. If there was a stream, people washed in it. When the water wasn't freezing, otherwise cleaning might involve wiping off dirt with leaves, handfuls of sand, or on rare luxury occasions. Animal fat, at this right fat, could be used to scrub the skin, which sounds odd until you realize it also helped with warmth, and insect-controlled teeth were another story. There were no toothbrushes, but some people chewed fibrous sticks or bones to clean their teeth. Dental wear was common, especially since the Paleolithic diet involved tough meat, unprocessed grains, and sand particles from grinding stones that got into food cavemen. Didn't brush, but they also didn't eat candy, so cavities were rare. Tooth loss from injury or wear, however, was a different matter. Hair care was minimal. Hair was usually long tied back or simply ignored. Lice were common. Some groups used ash dirt or animal oils to reduce infestations. Others may have resorted to the always effective method of scratching a lot and hoping it goes away. There is also evidence from later prehistoric periods of primitive combs or grooming tools, so some effort was made. Eventually, clothing didn't help matters. Animal hides were breathable, and they were washed often if they smelled people. Either got used to it or blamed. The person sitting closest to the fire feet were mostly bare or covered in wraparound hide shoes. As you can imagine, the smell of a prehistoric cave was distinctive. But here is the surprising part. Despite the lack of soap or showers, early humans adapted. Well, their immune systems were strong, and their communities understood enough about cleanliness to avoid major outbreaks. In fact, people probably smelled about the same, so no one really noticed unless you did something extreme, like roll in a dead animal, which, by the way, some people did for camouflage. Breakfast, there was no set time to eat. People ate when they could what they could, and only if there was anything left over from the day before. If you woke up to find a bit of dried meat still hanging by the fire, congratulations. You'd won the prehistoric lottery. But most mornings didn't start that way. If last night's hunt had failed, or the food was already eaten or stolen by a raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging. This might involve digging for roots, checking nearby berry bushes, or scanning the landscape for edible plants that hadn't already been claimed by animals or children. The choices were seasonal. Spring meant greens, summer brought fruits, and winter brought hunger. Protein was more unpredictable. Small animals, like birds, rabbits, or insects, were occasionally caught and eaten whole, or roasted. Insects were a reliable protein source. Breakfast, there was no set time to eat. People ate when they could, what they could, and only if there was anything left over from the day before. If you woke up to find a bit of dried meat still hanging by the fire, congratulations. You'd won the prehistoric lottery. But most mornings didn't start that way. If last night's hunt had failed, or the food was already eaten or stolen by a raccoon-like creature with ambition, then breakfast meant foraging. This might involve digging for roots, checking nearby berry bush, or scanning the landscape for edible plants that hadn't already been claimed by animals or children. The choices were seasonal. Spring meant greens, summer brought fruits, and winter brought hunger. Protein was more unpredictable. Small animals, like birds, rabbits, or insects, were occasionally caught and eaten whole, or roasted. Insects were a reliable protein source, even if nobody was particularly excited about it. If you found a termite mound or a handful of grubs that might become the morning meal, they didn't taste great, but they didn't bite back either. Sometimes you'd share with others, especially within your own family group. But food was a resource, not a courtesy. If someone brought back breakfast, it meant they were either generous or in charge, or both. Water was another priority. Streams, springs, and rivers were the main sources. If you were lucky, if not, puddles had to do boiling water wasn't a common practice yet, so most water was consumed raw and occasionally accompanied by bacteria, your gut either defeated or deeply regretted. Occasionally, there'd be a leftover from the last big hunt, smoked meat marrow from cracked bones or dried strips of hide that were technically edible with enough chewing. These were valuable. People stored them high, wrapped or hidden, though nothing could stop a determined child with a stick. So every morning was a new gamble. Maybe you'd find a few berries and a half-roasted squirrel. Maybe you'd find nothing. Either way, no one skipped breakfast on purpose. After breakfast, or the realization that breakfast wasn't happening, the next big task of the day was tool maintenance. Tools weren't just accessories. They were survival equipment without a good edge. You couldn't cut meat, scrape hides, or defend yourself. So a surprising amount of the day was spent hunched over rocks, hitting other rocks, trying to get just the right shape. Welcome to Paleolithic tool-making art. Craftsmanship, part trial and error, and entirely dependent on not smashing your thumb. The raw material of choice, flint or obsidian. If you were feeling fancy and lived near a volcano, these stones chipped predictably, which meant you could flake off sharp edges and create cutting tools. The basic starter pack included hand axes, scrapers, spearheads, and the very popular rock with a handle. There was no one-size-fits-all. Each tool had a purpose, some for butchering, others for shaping wood, and some for tasks we still don't fully understand, but probably involved hitting things. Most people made their own tools, but like everything else, some were better at it than others. If someone in the group had a knack for making perfectly balanced spear points, they earned respect and requests. Sharpening tools was constant. A dull edge was basically useless, and worse, dangerous. You'd either hurt yourself or waste time. Stones were ground, flaked, and tested daily. And yes, sometimes this meant spending 2 hours making something that broke after 2 minutes of use. You didn't complain, you just started over. Tool kits were often passed down, traded, or even stolen. If you lost yours, you weren't just embarrassed. You were in serious trouble. The moment you had nothing sharp on hand was usually the moment something with claws showed up. Occasionally creativity kicked in. Someone might tie a rock to a stick with animal sinew and call it a hammer. Others discovered bone tools, flexible, lightweight, and perfect for fine tasks. These innovations were the seeds of later technological revolutions. Even if their inventors were mostly just trying to cut something faster, once the tools were ready and breakfast, or the lack thereof, had been resolved, it was time to tackle the main event, the hunt. Hunting in the Paleolithic world wasn't a solo hobby, it was a full team operation, often involving every able-bodied member of the group plus one guy who mostly shouted useful things like, "Go left," and "That's not a deer." Large animals were the jackpot: mammoths, bison, wild horses. Anything big enough to feed the entire group for a week was worth the risk. But they were also dangerous. Mammoths didn't just stand around waiting to be speared. They were fast, heavy, and had absolutely no patience for hairless bipeds waving sharpened sticks. Spears, clubs, and clever ambush strategies were common. The one who made the kill earned first pick, a little extra respect, and maybe even an easier evening. Foraging might not have earned you epic stories, but it kept people alive quietly and consistently. Some plants looked inviting, but were anything but. Foragers built mental maps, memorizing which gullies held tubers, which trees dropped the tastiest nuts, and which green leaves were a one-way ticket to stomach cramps. This knowledge was passed down with care. Trial and error wasn't encouraged, but it was sometimes unavoidable. Restarting it involved friction, frustration, and sore arms spinning sticks over dry wood, begging for an ember to catch. Children would help, often bringing back things they were proud of that, upon inspection, turned out to be wet, mossy logs or inexplicably soggy mushrooms. Still, it was a start. Around the fire, life happened. People ate, talked, sharpened tools, and recounted their day. But for all its simplicity, these homes kept people dry-ish, warm-ish, and alive through many a storm. Once a child was born, you were immediately responsible for keeping a small, loud, very breakable human alive in a world full of cliffs, predators, and sharp rocks. And you had to do it without losing your spear or your sanity. Childbirth itself was a community event, painful, messy, and risky. If you survived it, congratulations. Now came the next challenge. Keeping your child warm, fed, and from sticking their fingers into the fire out of curiosity, which they did frequently. There were no diapers. Babies were swaddled in hides or plant fiber, and messes were just part of the job. You learned quickly to always set them down on rocks. Easier cleanup. Mothers usually breastfed for years since there was no baby formula, and chewing meat for a toddler was not considered efficient. The fire wasn't just warmth, it was community. The circle of flickering light was the center of it all. If someone fell asleep during their watch, the rest would wake up freezing and furious with a chorus of, "Guess who's making sparks tonight?" If your hands were cold or the air was damp, it could take hours. That's why most groups maintained a single fire constantly, even while on the move. In fact, someone might be assigned to carry a glowing coal wrapped in bark or moss, ensuring the flame made it to the next campsite. One ember to keep everyone warm. One ember to light the night. Women, older adults, and children too young to throw a spear without immediate regret would fan out across familiar territory, scanning for anything edible. Wild animals competed for the same food, and it was never fun explaining to the group how you lost a berry bush to a particularly aggressive squirrel. Caves were good if you found one. They offered shelter, warmth, and sometimes a bear roommate. But caves weren't always available or safe, so early humans got resourceful. Building homes was more about necessity than design. There were no floor plans, just a simple goal. Keep the cold out and the family in. If you didn't have stone walls, you made them. Frameworks of branches, bones, and vines were pieced together, then covered in hides, leaves, or packed mud to hold off the elements. The result? A slightly slanted structure that hopefully didn't collapse by morning. Sometimes the danger was quieter stumbling into a wasp nest or tripping over a snake while distracted by a cluster of mushrooms. The process wasn't efficient, but it was effective enough. Weather was the biggest threat. Rain turned your floor into soup. Wind ripped off coverings, and snow crushed any shelter not built with care. Seasonal structures became the solution lighter shelters for warmer months, heavier, layered homes for the dead of winter. A hole in the roof let out smoke, or let in rain. Still, foraging was usually more productive than hunting. Plants didn't run, berries didn't gore you, and nuts didn't hide behind boulders. The harvest, if timed right, could stretch across meals or tide the group over during days when the hunters came home with nothing but blisters and grumbling. Edible meant berries, nuts, roots, seeds, mushrooms, or even sweet tree sap and the occasional insect if the day was running thin. But hoarding was frowned upon. You needed your group, and burning bridges over meat only led to frosty silences around the fire. Hunting wasn't just survival, it was strategy, risk, and coordination, all with the looming threat of becoming a footnote in someone else's mammoth story. Snares and traps helped too, especially for smaller groups or lone hunters trying to prove themselves. But even with rabbits, things went wrong. Fire cooked your food, warmed your bones, and kept the predators at bay. It let you see your own hands after sunset and kept shadows from swallowing the camp. No one underestimated fire. It was precious. It was life. That's why someone, usually whoever had lost a bet, a game, or just looked too well rested, was put on fire duty. This job wasn't glamorous. It involved hovering near the flames, feeding them with whatever dry material you had, and occasionally panicking when the wind picked up or the embers dinned too low. One wrong step, and you were chasing a shrieking pig through the woods while shouting to your group about how close you were, really. Still, when the hunting party returned victorious, dragging fresh meat and stories of near misses, they returned as heroes. Other times, they came back empty-handed, offering only scrapes, bruises, and creatively embellished excuses. The wind shifted was a classic. Blaming the person who sneezed during the ambush was another favorite. Planning a hunt took real coordination. Scouts would go ahead to track the herd's movement. Others stayed back to prepare trap pits covered with branches, natural choke points along rivers, or even positioning near steep cliffs if the group was feeling ambitious and just the right amount of reckless. Then came the ambush yelling, spear throwing, sprinting across uneven terrain and hoping you hit something vital. The goal was simple: bring down a large animal, preferably before it brought down someone in your group. Smaller game like deer, boars, or rabbits meant a slightly less chaotic, but still unpredictable effort. Meat wasn't just food, it was status. Not everyone chased mammoths, though. Many had a more dependable, if less dramatic, task: finding things that didn't fight back. Knowing what was safe to eat came from experience, careful observation, and unfortunately, the occasional fatal mistake. Foraging had its dangers. The unsung hero of it all, though, was fire. Letting the fire go out was a group emergency. Fuel was everyone's responsibility. Dry branches, grass, even animal dung, if it burned, it was useful. Contrary to modern myths, not every early human lived in a cave. Construction was collaborative. Someone gathered wood, someone else tied things together, and someone stood nearby offering advice whether or not it was needed. Furniture was mostly wishful thinking. A flat spot to lie down, maybe a smooth rock to sit on, and hides layered for comfort. That was the dream. Parenting in the Paleolithic era came with no manuals, no podcasts, and definitely no baby strollers. Discipline was practical. If a kid wandered too close to a cliff, you didn't give them a timeout, you grabbed them by the leg and barked. Something like no fall. The stakes were high and safety rules had to be taught fast. Touching fire, chasing wolves, or trying to eat unknown berries were considered teachable moments, ideally before anything exploded, burned, or caused hallucinations. And parenting without sedation or screen time, early humans finally got to enjoy a little bit of what we might call downtime. Evening talk wasn't about the weather or the price of things. It was storytelling. Big stories. Funny stories. Warnings wrapped in words. There weren't rehearsals or organized performances. Someone would start humming. Another would tap stones together rhythmically. And before long, children would spin in wild circles, simply because no one told them not to. Sitting a little closer near the fire, offering a warm hide, or not laughing when someone confused dung for a root. These were the slow steps of prehistoric courtship. No candlelit dinners, but there were shared pieces of meat. If it stopped working, the split was quiet. Art didn't feed anyone, didn't keep you warm, and wouldn't chase off predators. But it spoke to something inside, something soft and strange. Caves became canvases. That meant someone lit a torch, walked into the dark, and created something no one might ever see again. No audience, no applause, just expression. Only the dice were made of bone and had mostly bad sides. People had observed which plants dulled pain, which ones made you sleepy, and which ones were never to be touched again. Chewed bark and crushed herbs offered primitive, but sometimes effective remedies. Willow bark, for instance, contained salicylic acid and ancient aspirin hiding in a tree. Somewhere, someone discovered this by chewing on a branch and realizing the headache faded just a little. There were no hospitals, no antibiotics, and certainly no urgent care. If you broke a limb, cut yourself, or developed a strange rash, your fate depended mostly on luck and whatever knowledge the group had pieced together from experience. But archaeologists have found skeletons with well-healed fractures, showing that care was given, and that people were allowed to rest. Someone brought them food, helped them move. They weren't abandoned. That, more than anything, shows a glimmer of early medicine. Not just herbs and wraps, but kindness. The first hospital might have been a quiet corner near the fire, and the first nurse someone who whispered, "Stay still. We've got you." In the best case, your body healed. In the worst, the fire grew a little quieter, and people exchanged worried looks. Children may have been involved. 2 tiny handprints lined some walls, suggesting that even the youngest were shown how to paint, how to belong. The first known cave paintings date back over 30,000 years, with famous examples in Lascaux and Chauvet in what is now France. These were not idle doodles. They were wrapped in moss, leaves, or animal hide and watched carefully. But infections were the real enemy. A cut might seem small, but could grow red, hot, and deadly. There were no sterile dressings and no understanding of bacteria, just a sharp eye and hope. They showed bison in motion, deer mid-stride, horses with wind in their manes lines that captured the living essence of these animals with a grace that still startles. No courts, no contracts, just a gradual shift in chores and sleeping arrangements. The first airbrush, made not for beauty salons, but for stories in the dark. The pigments were simple charcoal, ochre, crushed minerals mixed with water, animal fat, or spit. The brushes were fingers, twigs, or chewed plants. No one knows for certain why they painted. Maybe it was ritual. Maybe it was memory. Maybe someone just wanted to leave a mark before time could erase them. Romance was real, but not theatrical. People simply didn't want to face the wild alone. And somehow, even without flowers or deodorant, love found a way. What's remarkable is that this art endured. Long after the huts fell, the fires died, and the bones turned to dust, those animals still gallop across cave walls. They remain as proof that even then, we needed to create, to express, to make something beautiful, even if no one else ever saw it. And maybe, just maybe, they really did just like bison. The first step toward love was proximity. In a small group, your dating pool was limited to whoever wasn't related or already paired. It wasn't ideal, but no one swiped left on a mammoth hide-clad partner who helped carry water and never let the fire go out. Flirting was practical. Sharing tasks was the ultimate green flag. Appearance played a role, but survival skills outweighed fashion. Everyone wore fur, dirt, and whatever bones they could strap on without falling over. What mattered was whether you could contribute, protect, and endure. Romantic bonds formed quietly, through cooperation and mutual survival. Instruments included hollow bones, stretched hide drums, and anything that made a pleasing noise. Rhythm came from instinct. Joy came from participation. People recounted the day's hunt, embellished near misses, and told tales about spirits, ancestors, or that one time someone fell into the river chasing a fish. Storytelling wasn't just entertainment. It was how knowledge was passed on, what to eat, what to avoid, where to find shelter, how to read the stars. Every tale came with gestures, grunts, and sometimes wild flailing to reenact traumatic moments. It wasn't glamorous. There were no drinks with umbrellas or lazy hammocks under the stars. But it was human, and it mattered. Paleolithic social life didn't revolve around brunch or banter. If a hunt went well, you heard about it often, and with increasing flair. Social status wasn't based on wealth or looks. It was skill-based. The best hunter, the most consistent firekeeper, the one who could identify herbs without poisoning the group. These were the stars of the evening. It revolved around fire. As the sun dipped low and the sky turned to charcoal, the group circled around the flames, not for a party, but because the fire was the only thing between warmth and cold, light and total darkness. Lessons were short, sharp, and designed to stick. Still, Paleolithic parenting wasn't all danger and dire warnings. Children had time and space to grow in their own way. They played constantly, freely, and with whatever they could find: sticks, stones, feathers, bugs, or oddly shaped rocks. Anything that looked remotely interesting became a toy, a challenge, or sometimes a snack. Play was how they explored the world and discovered their place in it. A child who liked throwing rocks might one day be the tribe's best hunter. One who sat still watching the elders might become a shaman or healer, absorbing stories and rituals without needing to be told. No one asked, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" You simply became what you became, shaped by your environment, your instincts, and the survival skills you could gather along the way. Older children were given tasks, gradually integrated into daily life. They fetched water, gathered kindling, chased away birds trying to steal drying meat, and helped with whatever needed helping. By the time they were 10, they were considered semi-functional members of society, still noisy, occasionally reckless, but now useful. Education wasn't formal, but it was constant. Children learned through watching, repeating, and trial by mud. They didn't have toys with instructions or warnings. They had nature, and nature didn't care whether you were ready or not. The world was their classroom, and every lesson mattered. After a long day filled with hunting, foraging, scraping hides, dodging wild animals, here, gathered close to its glow, people shared food, comfort, and conversation. Music and dancing slipped naturally into this quiet gathering. Bragging also made regular appearances. If someone made a good spear, they showed it off. And yes, there was flirting. Not many options in a group of 20 to 40 people, so romantic gestures were subtle. Sharing food was a huge sign of affection. There were no love songs, but there was warmth. Pair bonds often lasted, but not always. People stayed together for many reasons: to raise children, share food, make it through difficult winters. Despite the relentless cycle of gathering, hunting, fire tending, and not dying, early humans found time for something entirely and beautifully unnecessary: art. Some of these images featured dots, abstract shapes, or hand stencils pressed against stone and sprayed with pigment from a hollow bone. Art lived deep within the caves, far from where people slept. And somewhere, someone probably grunted their approval or gently teased a bison's odd proportions. Getting sick or injured in the Paleolithic era was a bit like rolling dice with the universe, but medicine did exist in a humble, early form. Wounds were cleaned with water or plant-based antiseptics if known. Broken bones were a gamble. Some healed, some didn't. But there were also people who clearly kept moving on bad limbs because there wasn't much choice. Pain wasn't optional, and neither was staying behind. Life moved, and you moved with it, limping, bracing, adjusting to the ache until it became background noise. Toothaches were another unrelenting challenge. Teeth wore down from endless chewing of tough meat, sinew, and plants laced with grit. Cavities weren't widespread, but when they did happen, along with jaw infections, they weren't taken lightly. Others stretched far, covering dozens or even hundreds of miles across ridges and rivers, across shifting terrain and changing skies. People remembered. They used stars, animal tracks, oddly shaped rocks, and the unique scent of the river bend to guide them. The place with the crooked tree, the hill that looks like a sleeping bear. These were the street signs of memory. Movement required coordination. Scouts went ahead. And generally not dying, early humans ended their day in the only place that made sense around the fire. Roasted meat, maybe boiled roots, or the few forage scraps that hadn't been eaten along the way. A piece of bone doubled as a flute. A stone struck rhythm against another. It wasn't polished, and it wasn't for performance. It was just one more way to push back the dark. Most people were tired by now, bone-tired. Children curled up and drifted off, nestled into furs or tucked beside parents. The adults remained a little longer, eyes on the flames. Some spoke. Some sat in silence. Others simply stared, thinking of nothing or everything all at once. The fire didn't just give light. It gave a sense of time, of rhythm, of closure. Meals weren't plated. They were passed by hand, shared communally as the group huddled in a loose circle. People crouched or sat cross-legged, using their fingers, bones, or carved sticks. There was no formal etiquette, but there were unspoken customs. Don't grab, don't waste, and if you didn't help kill it, maybe take a smaller bite. After eating, the mood softened. People spoke. Plans for tomorrow were murmured. Stories were told of spirits, ancestors, or the fool who tried to hug a porcupine. These tales, passed from one fire to the next, were how knowledge stayed alive. A living memory wrapped in warmth and smoke. The sun didn't linger. It sank fast, and with no electricity or lanterns, night fell like a curtain. Darkness was complete and not to be negotiated with. So the fire, soft and flickering, became the tribe's closing act. Quietly, carefully, they nudged logs, adjusted barriers, added fuel. If the wind shifted, they repositioned whatever shielded the flame. It was the most important task no one wanted and everyone depended on. Because if it went out, the cold crept in. If it went out, the group would wake shivering. If it went out, it had to be rebuilt from scratch. So the fire burned on, gently, quietly, the last heartbeat of the day. Equal parts comfort and caution, it offered warmth, protection, and the last shared breath of the day. The rest moved cautiously, often in single file, watching, listening, staying close. If someone was hurt, the pace slowed. If the sky darkened, shelter was found. The goal wasn't just speed, it was unity. Getting separated meant getting lost, and in the prehistoric wilderness, being lost was not something you wanted to be. Everything had to be carried. Your tools, your sleeping hides, your children, your memories. Bags were leather. Baskets were woven from reeds. And your back? It did most of the lifting. Weather was another silent companion. Rain slicked the paths. Wind stung the eyes. Snow made each step slower, heavier. And through it all, someone, probably a tired child, asked, "Are we there yet?" Uphill, always uphill. The solution was direct and brutal. Removal, often with a rock, and definitely without anesthesia. You didn't wait for a miracle. You opened your mouth and hoped for mercy. Fossils and artifacts show that they migrated across entire continents on foot. No GPS, no rest stops. Just grit, barefoot determination, and the quiet, insistent need to see what lay beyond the next hill. Shamans or medicine people stepped in as early doctors. Part herbalist, part spiritual guide, part brave soul willing to touch the untouchable. They used rituals, chants, and substances that today might be labeled hallucinogenic. But back then, they were tools of mystery and belief. If you wanted to go somewhere, you walked. That was the reality. Travel wasn't convenience, it was endurance. Every move, whether to follow game, relocate for water, or just escape the neighbors who kept stealing your firewood, came down to putting one foot in front of the other. Mobility was survival. Most Paleolithic groups were nomadic. They followed the rhythm of the seasons, the movement of herds, and the slow retreat of winter. When the camp grew stale or food grew scarce, people packed up everything: tools, hides, fire kits, dried food if any remained, and started walking. Was it science? Not by modern standards. Did it work? Sometimes. And that small, sometimes, was enough to keep the rituals going. Early medical care wasn't built on certainty. It was built on hope, observation, trial, and the unspoken trust that someone, anyone, might help you see one more sunrise. You got rest. You got attention. You got watched. And sometimes, you got lucky. If not, your space around the fire grew colder, and someone else took your place by nightfall. In the Paleolithic world, There were no wagons, no wheels, no roads, and absolutely no concept of catching a ride. Some journeys were short, just a few miles to the next valley or hunting ground. There were no maps, but navigation wasn't blind. And yet, somehow, humans moved miles upon miles, generation after generation. After a long day of hunting, gathering, walking, parenting, tool fixing, dinner, if it happened, was simple and honest. Sometimes there was music. Simple chants, rhythmic claps, or the hollow beat of a log. Before sleep, someone always checked the fire. Where entire factories, as long as several football fields were built from scratch. Their mission: enrich uranium-1 of the two elusive ingredients needed to build an atomic bomb. The challenge, however, was immense. Uranium-235, the specific isotope required, made up less than 1% of all natural uranium. That rarity meant separating. It was like trying to extract a single thread from a tangled mass. He was nothing like the engineers or generals around him. At Los Alamos, he didn't just lead, he orchestrated. Running on little sleep and fueled by a relentless drive, he darted between chalkboards and strategy meetings, sketching formulas and hashing out designs. Plutonium couldn't be used in a gun-type design. It was too unstable. So scientists developed a new approach: implosion. Inside the laboratories of Los Alamos, the final bomb components were coming together: metal casings, detonators, and nuclear cores, each crafted with precision and dread. The test was called Trinity. It was the first detonation of a nuclear device in human history. A shockwave thundered outward, knocking people off their feet. But it also proved something deeper: that humanity had entered a new age, one defined not just by fire, but by moral weight. Instruments captured data. Photographs were taken. At ground zero, sand had melted into a new green glass they called trinitite. But what lingered most wasn't the data. It was the silence, the heavy awareness that something irreversible had just happened. The threshold had been crossed, and there was no going back. News of the test was kept tightly sealed. The heat reached miles beyond the blast. A mushroom cloud climbed 40,000 feet into the sky. One man called it the birth of a new world. Another, the opening of the gates of hell. Oppenheimer did not celebrate. He murmured words from the Bhagavad Gita: "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The bomb they tested was the Fat Man-designed plutonium-based, complex, untested. It could work, it could fail, or it could bring unintended disaster. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Scientists and officers watched from miles away. Some wore welding goggles. Others smeared sunscreen on their faces, unsure what would happen when this new light arrived. They even placed bets. One prediction joked that the bomb might ignite the sky. The moment of testing was near. No more equations. No more theory. The next step was fire. Explosive lenses, timed with extraordinary precision, would compress the plutonium core in milliseconds. It was like trying to crush a steel sphere evenly from all sides, using nothing but detonations complex and highly volatile. And plutonium, unlike uranium, was far more dangerous to handle. As they worked, accidents happened. In 1945, physicist Harry Daghlian accidentally dropped a tungsten brick near a plutonium core, triggering a burst of radiation. He died weeks later. The same core would later kill another scientist, Louis Slotin, in a similarly tragic accident. They called it the Demon Core. His leadership was intense, yet charismatic. He managed a team of eccentric, competitive minds, each one a prodigy in their own right, and somehow kept them aligned. But as the project advanced and victory in Europe drew near, his unease grew. What began as a race against Hitler was quickly shifting into something else, something darker. The bomb was no longer just about defense. It was becoming a weapon of geopolitical power. That truth gnawed at him. He was a complex man, fragile, brilliant, and contemplative. The Manhattan Project had transformed into a massive production effort. They were building bombs, not on paper, but in bunkers and workshops. Two bomb designs had taken form. The first, a uranium-based weapon, was nicknamed Little Boy. It worked like a gun firing one piece of uranium into another to trigger a chain reaction. Simple in concept, terrifying in execution. There would be no test for Little Boy. Its first detonation would happen in combat. Every calculation had to be flawless. He spoke 6 languages, quoted ancient Hindu scripture, and chain-smoked through lectures and lab briefings. Despite a background that raised suspicions past associations with communists, a politically active brother, and a mistress tied to radical circles, he was appointed scientific director of the Manhattan Project. General Leslie Groves, trusting his instincts, overruled objections, and put faith in Oppenheimer's genius. That decision shaped history. Engineers tried every method they could think of: gaseous diffusion, electromagnetic separation, and even strange devices called calatrons. Thousands of workers, most of them young women, spent day after day operating mysterious machines they didn't fully understand. They weren't told what they were building, just that it mattered, and that precision was everything. Far to the northwest, in Hanford, Washington, another path to the bomb was unfolding. Here, they weren't enriching uranium. They were creating plutonium. Unlike uranium-235, plutonium didn't exist in useful quantities naturally. But in newly built nuclear reactors, massive steel and concrete giants, set in isolation, scientists discovered they could bombard uranium to breed it. These reactors ran day and night, glowing with heat and humming with atomic energy. Once formed, the plutonium had to be extracted, refined, and quietly shipped to Los Alamos for use. But along with this new element came new consequences: radioactive leaks, contamination, and the first steps into what would become the long shadow of nuclear environmental damage. Altogether, over 130,000 people worked on the Manhattan Project, more than the population of some U.S. states at the time. Secret towns sprang up almost overnight, built for this hidden world. These towns had schools, stores, post offices, barbershops, and rows of government housing. They also had fences, guards, censored letters, and monitored phone calls. No one really knew what they were working on, not even the vice president, Harry Truman, who remained unaware of the project's true scope until the moment he assumed the presidency. This was no longer a science experiment. It had become a nation within a nation, industrial, military, bureaucratic, and deeply human. Life carried on within the secret. People fell in love, gave birth, endured accidents, grew restless, and sometimes died, all while contributing to an invention whose name they did not know. At the center of this scientific storm was J. Robert Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer had a unique gift. He could take the dizzying abstractions of theoretical physics and translate them into real-world devices. By late 1944, all the theoretical puzzles had given way to metal, wires, and casings. The second bomb, Fat Man, used plutonium, but it wasn't so simple. Through all the strain, the project raced ahead. Germany had surrendered. Japan was still fighting, and Washington wanted an end. On July 16, 1945, at precisely 5:29 I, the New Mexico desert bore witness to something never before seen. Then it happened. In a blinding instant, the desert flashed brighter than the sun. The test was a success, a cold, awe-inspiring success. It proved the bomb would work. President Truman, then attending the Potsdam Conference in Germany, was informed via a coded message: "The baby is born." At that moment, the war still raged in the Pacific. The United States had 2 functioning bombs and 1 fateful decision. Others demanded terms. The United States, hearing silence, prepared a second strike. On August 9th, another B-29, Boxcar, carried the second bomb, Fat Man, or a devastating display of force. Some scientists begged for a non-lethal demonstration to warn Japan. Their pleas went unheeded. Others, like General Groves, felt no remorse. What mattered was the result. The world, however, had changed. It was now a place where peace was held hostage by unimaginable destruction. The bomb had succeeded militarily, but philosophically, ethically, spiritually, it had left a wound that would never fully close. America's monopoly had lasted barely 5 years. The world had become a nuclear chessboard. Loyalty oaths, background checks, and congressional hearings became common. The Red Scare took hold. Scientists who had once been national heroes were now suspects. Even Oppenheimer was not immune. In a humiliating hearing, he was stripped of his security clearance, his patriotism questioned, his legacy shattered. The bomb had ended one war, but it had birthed another. Cold, ideological, and infinitely more perilous. From that point forward, warfare no longer meant bullets or tanks. It meant deterrence, second strikes, and ever-growing arsenals. One shaped not by diplomacy, but by the constant presence of apocalypse. A world where silence and suspicion ruled, and where each sunrise brought with it the possibility of catastrophe. Survival no longer depended on soldiers, but on strategy. Could you deliver retaliation before your cities disappeared? It reshaped the world scientifically, militarily, politically, and morally. The intended target was Kokura, but clouds obscured it. There was the world before the bomb, and everything that followed. The mushroom clouds had barely dissipated before those involved began to grapple with what had happened. Espionage had penetrated the effort from the start. Soviet agents moved through labs and barracks, unnoticed. On one hand, the project marked an unprecedented scientific achievement. It proved that theoretical physics could shape global events, that pure research could transform into raw power. The same principles that split atoms would go on to power nuclear energy, guide space exploration, and advance medicine. Nuclear physics became a cornerstone of modern science. On the other hand, it introduced a permanent shadow over humanity. The invention of nuclear. One of the most infamous, Klaus Fuchs, a theoretical physicist at Los Alamos, handed over secrets so detailed that Soviet engineers used them as blueprints. He wasn't alone. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, American civilians with communist ties, were accused of helping pass atomic secrets. Their trial ended in execution, one of the Cold War's most controversial moments. Were they traitors or scapegoats? The truth remains clouded, but the signal was clear. The nuclear age had begun, and it belonged to more than one nation. At Los Alamos, the mood was not celebratory. Yes, the bombs had worked. Yes, the war had ended. But the human cost weighed heavily. Photographs of bodies, flattened buildings, and scorched earth arrived in quiet packages. Stories from survivors began to trickle in, and the scientists who had once thrilled at pushing the boundaries of physics now found themselves standing at the edge of something vast and bleak. The bomb instead fell on Nagasaki at 11:02 a.m. In a meeting with President Truman, he reportedly said, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, disturbed, later called him a crybaby. But Oppenheimer's guilt was not unique. Scientists like Leo Szilard and James Frank circulated petitions calling for international oversight and transparency. They warned of arms races and endless escalation, but their words were ignored. Instead, the U.S. cemented control over nuclear research. The Atomic Energy Commission was born, and in the shadow of Hiroshima, the Cold War began to smolder. The terrain softened the blow somewhat, but the destruction remained horrific. 40,000 people died instantly. Homes, temples, factories all disappeared in fire and shock. And once again, the slow deaths began: radiation, trauma, despair. On August 6, 1945, A B-29 bomber named Enola Gay lifted off from Tinian Island. Its cargo, Little Boy, the uranium bomb. In that calm, solemn voice, he announced surrender. Unconditional. The war was over. The target, Hiroshima, a city with military significance, but filled with civilians. At 8:15 a.m., the bomb fell. Just 43 seconds later, the sky bloomed into a light hotter than anything humanity had ever known. The explosion flattened 5 square miles. At ground zero, temperatures soared past 7,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Over 70,000 lives ended in an instant vaporized, crushed, or consumed by fire. Survivors, blinded and burned, wandered through landscapes reduced to ash and twisted metal. In the weeks that followed, tens of thousands more would die of radiation sickness, of injuries, of grief. Japan had not surrendered. But now, the United States possessed something new, something terrible. The power to end the war and to end entire cities. The question was no longer if they would use it. The question had become when and where. Less than a month after the Trinity test, the theoretical nightmare became real. But the war did not end. Japan's leaders hesitated. Some wanted surrender. Within hours, the Japanese cabinet met in desperation. For the first time in history, Emperor Hirohito spoke directly to his people. But the arguments had only begun. Did the bomb end the war? Or did it begin something far worse? Was it necessary? In 2 bursts of light, the 20th century cracked in 2. Oppenheimer, once the beating heart of the Manhattan Project, fell into darkness. The Soviet Union, already well informed thanks to spies within the Manhattan Project, accelerated their bomb program. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviets detonated their first bomb. In America, fear spread. From secret laboratories in the American Southwest to the labor camps of the Soviet East, a new world had emerged. The Manhattan Project ended in 1946, but its impact never did. It was in many ways the birth of the modern era. Weapons didn't just end a war, they redefined peace. For the first time in history, humanity had created something capable of extinguishing itself. That quiet, terrible possibility has lingered over every international conflict since. It suggests a paradox, that the bomb, in all its horror, might also be its own deterrent, driven by discovery and then brought low by its consequences. In 1965, reflecting on what they had done, Oppenheimer said, in some sort of crude sense which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin. Your class, your profession, even your favor with the gods. Decorative fringes and intricate embroidery signaled wealth and divine connection, but for warding off evil and the harsh desert sun. And though most walked barefoot, the elite sometimes wore ceremonial sandals of leather, or even silver, never for comfort, always for symbolism. Modesty, as we know, it didn't exist here. Fertility and divine beauty were sacred virtues. But wigs made from human hair, or palm fiber, announced rank and beauty. To the Greeks, fashion reflected order, logic, and the ideals of the polis. Garments were rarely tailored. Instead, they were rectangles of wool, or linen draped with precision. Women's hair was more elaborate, with braids and coils woven into expressions of status and occasion. Everything in Greek fashion was a reflection of deeper values: order, proportion, moderation. It wasn't about dazzling the eye. It was about aligning the body with the ideals of the soul. The chiton, a tunic pinned at the shoulders and belted at the waist, was the staple. Men wore knee-length versions. Women's reached the floor. Even this small difference carried meaning: youth, priesthood, athleticism, or propriety could all be read in the cut. Some were enormous, braided with care, and perfumed with cones of scented wax that melted throughout the day, slowly releasing fragrance. Philosophers often wrapped it tightly, as if clothing the mind. The visual simplicity mirrored their inward focus. For women, the peplus offered a heavier option-draped wool, folded down at the top to create a symbolic double layer. This fold, the apoptygma, wasn't just style, it signaled modesty, piety, and even social role. Colors, though limited, spoke in hushed tones. White for purity, deep saffron or rare purple for ritual or wealth. Embroidery was minimal, but meaningful. Makeup was a sacred art. Kohl eyeliner shielded the eyes from the sun and spirits alike. Green malachite shadow and red ochre lip stain adorned both men and women. Looking good wasn't about vanity. It was about order, balance, and readiness for judgment in the afterlife. Whether building pyramids or attending temple ceremonies, every outfit whispered of eternity. These garments were sensual and symbolic, drawing a connection between physical form and spiritual harmony. Jewelry served as both ornament and amulet. Scarabs, Ankh symbols, and the protective eye of Horus adorned necks, wrists, and ankles. Gold, seen as the flesh of the gods, was sacred. Massive broad collars, or wesseks, layered with turquoise, lapis lazuli, and carnelian weren't just beautiful, they were armor for the soul. In Mesopotamia, clothing wasn't vanity. It was ritual, identity, destiny. Jewelry was essential gold chains, lapis lazuli earrings, and carnelian beads served both as beauty and as symbols of lineage or protection. Clothing was an offering to the gods, a reflection of inner purity and a preparation for eternity. Linen, spun from flax, ruled the wardrobe. Soft, breathable, and light, it suited the desert's unforgiving heat. But the quality of linen mattered. The higher your status, the finer, wider, and more transparent your garment. Nobility wore pleated kilts or robes, starched into architectural shapes, often tied with ornate sashes that shimmered in temple light. Bracelets and anklets marked spiritual beliefs or marital status. Even hair spoke a language of power and tradition. Men curled and oiled their beards, crafting them into deliberate patterns that embodied strength and wisdom. Women arranged their hair into buns, braids, or elaborate rolls, sometimes wearing wigs scented with oils. Clothing was a code, understood by all. From priest-kings to laborers, everyone adhered to these woven hierarchies. Men wore simple wool skirts or long robes adorned with pleats and fringe. The more elaborate the fabric, the more powerful the man. Nobles favored cloaks dyed in vivid reds, purples, and indigos, pigments extracted painstakingly from minerals and rare plants. These colors weren't just beautiful, they were status. To wear them was to declare your place without saying a word. His words carried the weight of an age. Its sheer capacity for destruction has perhaps stayed the hand that wields it. Culturally, the Manhattan Project left deep, unhealed scars etched into film, literature, and the human conscience. It forced a question into the heart of modern civilization. Can science exist without conscience? Can knowledge be separated from responsibility? The doctrine of mutually assured destruction became the strange backbone of Cold War diplomacy. Two superpowers armed beyond imagination, locked in a stalemate where pressing a single button could end civilization. The Manhattan Project didn't just end a war. It ignited an arms race. The United States, the Soviet Union. In stockpiles, guarded in silence. In treaties forged to prevent their spread. In diplomatic tensions kept in fragile check by fear. In the uneasy peace enforced by the specter of annihilation. The bomb ended World War II, but it began something else too. A long, permanent, uncertain chapter. A world forever aware that its future could hinge on the trembling finger of a single decision. Then Britain, France, China, India, Pakistan, Israel unofficially, and eventually North Korea, each developed their own bomb. What began as a desperate scientific gamble to stop Nazi Germany had evolved into a worldwide pursuit of nuclear dominance. And yet, Despite all the fear and the firepower, nuclear weapons have only been used in war twice. That alone is chilling and oddly hopeful. Figures like Oppenheimer came to embody that question. Not villains, not heroes, but people brilliant, flawed, and human. Today, the legacy of the Manhattan Project lives on. In ancient Mesopotamia, what you wore wasn't just about covering your body, it was about revealing your place in the world. Elite women wore gowns that wrapped diagonally, bearing one shoulder and draping in soft, elegant folds. Perfumes and cosmetics completed the look. Scented oils of myrrh or cedar softened the skin, while kohl lined the eyes, not just for beauty. In ancient Egypt, fashion took on a divine weight. Women wore sheath dresses colosseus that hugged the body and emphasized curves. Wigs were an everyday ritual for the elite. Most Egyptians shaved their heads to stay clean and free of lice. In ancient Greece, simplicity ruled, but simplicity with purpose. Over the chiton, both sexes wore the himation, a cloak draped with stately elegance. Hairstyles added another layer to this subtle language. Men often wore their hair, short, practical, clean, aligned with civic duty. Braids, buns, and curls all had their season. Jewelry was elegant but restrained gold earrings, intricate hairpins, and bracelets shaped like snakes or leaves. Shoes were optional. Many Greeks went barefoot at home or during ritual events. When they did wear footwear, it was typically simple leather sandals or soft boots. Wealthy women wore elaborate hairstyles piled high with curls, braids, and pins, a fashion that required both a mirror and several servants. Footwear ranged from simple sandals to leather boots dyed red, green, or black. Senators had their own shoe style, the kelsey, marked by black leather and laces across the ankle. Form met function. Greek fashion was elegance through discipline. To be dressed appropriately was to embody Rome's values: discipline, hierarchy, conquest, and civic pride. White symbolized purity and was often worn by priests during sacred rituals. Red and gold were symbols of fire, the sacred element of Zoroastrianism, Persia's dominant faith. Persian fashion was never accidental. Every fold, every gem, every stitched griffin or lion carried a message. The cosmos is ordered, the king is divine, and you, based on your clothes, better know your place in it. It was a living philosophy, soft, unstitched, layered in meaning, and always attuned to the divine. Whether during the Shang, Zhou, or Han dynasties, what you wore reflected your social role, your harmony with the universe, and your relationship to the emperor. The most iconic garment was the hanfu, a flowing robe with wide sleeves, a crossed collar, and a sash at the waist. It wasn't just clothing. It was a visual embodiment of Confucian ideals. Modesty, structure, and respect for hierarchy were sewn into every pleat. A toga wasn't just cloth. It was the Roman Republic draped in wool. From the Vedic period through the Maurya and Gupta empires, Indian clothing reflected a deep philosophical worldview where texture, color, and drapery were not just aesthetic but sacred. Colors were strictly regulated under the Zhou dynasty's color codes. The cornerstone of ancient Indian fashion was unstitched cloth. Instead of tailoring, garments were wrapped, folded, and draped in a variety of regional and symbolic styles. This wasn't a shortcut, it was a principle. In Hindu belief, stitching was sometimes considered impure for ritual wear, so flowing fabrics became a canvas of self-expression and spiritual identity. In a society obsessed with balance and virtue, the drape of a tunic or the tie of a sash wasn't just aesthetic, it was a reflection of how one lived, thought, and contributed to the polis. It could be formal or casual, and the style of folding differed by region and caste. Priests wore it in specific ritual folds aligned with ceremonies. Women wore the sari, still famous today, but in ancient times it looked quite different. Usually a single piece of cloth up to 9 yards long, wrapped around the waist with one end draped over the shoulder or head. It left the midriff bare not as a fashion statement, but as a gesture of fertility and cosmic openness. In many temples, goddesses were adorned in this exact style, reflecting the sacred femininity of the land. From Darius the Great to Xerxes, Persian rulers dressed not merely to impress, but to intimidate. Earlier periods saw a great variation in upper body coverings, depending on social norms and climate. In southern India, women often wore the sari without a blouse, while in colder regions, shawls and veils were added. Textiles were India's pride. Cotton was first cultivated here, and Indian weavers mastered block printing, resist dyeing, and fine spinning. The muslin of Bengal was so delicate, it was called woven air. Silk was a staple of royal and sacred attire, especially in Buddhist and Jain traditions. Jewelry was worn by all classes: necklaces, bangles, anklets, nose rings, each piece holding astrological, spiritual, or marital meaning. Even children wore talismans to ward off evil. Unlike other ancient societies where robes dominated, Persians adopted fitted pants for both practicality and fashion. It was revolutionary, influencing Greek, Roman, and even medieval dress. A wide, ornate belt often cinched the tunic at the waist, while layered cloaks draped across the shoulders added weight and formality. To see a Persian nobleman walk into a room was to witness a human jewel box shimmering in embroidered silks, gold ornaments, and divine iconography. Long dresses with fitted bodices and multiple fabric layers were common, along with wide sleeves and veils. Jewelry was abundant: gold necklaces, gemstone bracelets, and intricately carved rings. Perfume and cosmetics also featured heavily. Women wore rouge, kohl eyeliner, and scented oils stored in elegant alabaster jars. Headgear was critical. The tiara or charis, a tall pointed headdress often decorated with pearls or embroidery, was a signature of Persian royalty. Even lower-ranked courtiers wore embroidered caps or turbans to show loyalty to the king. The more elaborate your headgear, the closer you were to the throne. Clothing here was about power, but also about cosmology. Unlike the more minimalist Greeks, Persians embraced vivid colors and luxurious textures. Silk, arriving via early trade routes, was reserved for the elite. Embroidery was everything. Tunics and robes were heavily decorated with gold thread, mythical animal motifs, and elaborate patterns symbolizing fertility, protection, and divine favor. The more detailed your garment, the higher your position, and the closer your aura was to the king. If the Greeks used fashion to express ideals, the Romans used it to display dominance. Roman clothing was bold, regulated, and highly symbolic, designed to reflect the empire's strict social hierarchy and its love for spectacle and control. Slaves wore rough, undyed tunics. Freedmen might wear striped versions to mark their limited status, while senators had a purple stripe called a latus clavis down the front. Fashion in Rome wasn't about individualism. It was about knowing your place. Roman women wore the stola, a long flowing dress often paired with the palla, a shawl that could cover the head in public. Respectable matrons wore distinct stolae as badges of chastity and virtue, while prostitutes were banned from wearing them. A literal fashion divide between dignity and disgrace. What you wore in Rome wasn't just a personal choice. It was often a legal requirement. The most iconic Roman garment was the toga, and it wasn't for comfort. Reserved for Roman male citizens only, especially the elite, the toga was a massive semicircular woolen cloth draped intricately over the body. It required practice or a personal slave to wear properly. The color, size, and decorative stripe of your toga immediately signaled your status. A plain white toga virilis was worn by adult male citizens. The toga praetexta with a purple border was for magistrates and high-ranking boys. The fully purple toga picta, embellished with gold, was reserved for generals in triumphal processions and eventually emperors. To wear the wrong toga could result in public disgrace or worse. Underneath, men wore a tunic, a simpler knee-length garment belted at the waist. Jewelry was abundant, especially among women. Rings, necklaces, fibula brooches, and earrings were not just decorations. They were currency, status markers, and political gifts. In Rome, clothing was law, art, and propaganda rolled into one. In the Achaemenid Persian Empire, fashion was nothing short of regal theater. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics with trousers underneath, innovative for the time. Women's fashion was equally refined, the more modest by design. Colors had meaning too. Deep blues and purples were reserved for royalty and high nobility. In ancient India, fashion was an art form tied intimately to religion, climate, and cosmic balance. For men, the most common garment was the dhotia, a rectangular piece of cloth, often white or saffron, wrapped around the waist and tied in a knot. The blouse worn under the sari, the choli, emerged later. In ancient India, fashion was not bound by fast-changing trends. In ancient China, fashion was far more than decoration. It was a living system of ethics, cosmology, and imperial order. Men and women alike wore hanfu, but the details, color, fabric, trim, and length differed dramatically based on class, age, and occasion. Colors were established to align with the 5 elements philosophy. Yellow for earth and center, red for fire and south, blue-green for wood and east, white for metal and west, and black for water and north. Yellow is especially sacred, reserved for the emperor alone. To wear it as a commoner was a direct insult to the throne. Layering was key. It reflected the natural order, expressed human dignity, and upheld the invisible scaffolding of the empire. To dress properly wasn't just courteous, it was a civic and spiritual duty. Celtic men and women wore brightly colored woolen garments, often dyed with natural pigments from plants and minerals. Patterns were a big deal. Plaids and checks weren't just decorative, they were tribal identifiers. Each region or clan had its preferred style, centuries before Scotland's tartan system developed. In Byzantium, clothing wasn't just about status or wealth. It was a sacred language. Even small accents of purple on robes or shoes indicated a connection to the throne. Senators, clergy, and generals had their own color codes and uniform-like outfits for ceremonies. Merchants, scholars, monks, and servants all had clearly defined clothing styles. You didn't just dress for the weather. You dressed for your role in God's order. In Byzantium, fashion wasn't a choice. It was destiny sanctified by scripture and stitched in silk. Your robe wasn't just a garment. It was your gospel. Byzantine fashion was layered and modest. Both men and women wore tunics called dalmatica with wide sleeves and embroidered, bands known as clavi running vertically down the front. If you were nearsighted, reading or fine craftsmanship became nearly impossible. The earliest written reference to impaired vision comes from ancient Egyptian medical papyri from as early as 1500 BCE, describing symptoms that sound like presbyopia, age-related farsightedness. But treatment was largely magical or herbal. There's no evidence of any optical devices. These tools date back to around the 10th or 11th century in Europe and the Middle East. They were useful but clunky. You had to press them against the page, and they only helped with one line at a time. If you were farsighted, sewing, carving, or copying manuscripts was a daily struggle. Yet for most of human history, there was no solution, just quiet resignation. Over these, they wore cloaks like the chlamys, fastened with ornate brooches often shaped like crosses or doves. These layers weren't just practical. They reflected religious values of humility and decorum. Seneca the Younger, in the 1st century CE, reportedly used a glass globe filled with water to magnify text. It worked like a crude magnifying lens, but wasn't wearable. The first true magnifying lenses came from the Islamic Golden Age. Scholars in Baghdad and Cairo were experimenting with optics as early as the 9th century. The mathematician Alhazen, also known as Ibn al-Haytham, wrote the Book of Optics in the 11th century, laying the groundwork for the science of vision. He described how light enters the eye and how lenses could bend it. But again, there's no record of wearable lenses. Every thread, every jewel, every embroidered icon was part of a divine and political performance. The Byzantine court was obsessed with ceremonial dress. Elite women wore long-sleeved robes with tight cuffs, heavily patterned silk fabrics, and elaborate head coverings. Veils and crowns signaled both piety and power. Jewelry was plentiful heavy earrings, multi-strand necklaces, and golden belts adorned with religious icons and saints. Even their shoes were embroidered. Christianity influenced everything. Crosses, angels, and sacred inscriptions appeared on belts, pins, and borders of garments. Churches were filled with mosaics depicting saints and royalty in dazzling robes, real fashion immortalized in art. The emperor, seen as God's representative on earth, wore garments so intricate and heavily adorned they bordered on the theatrical. His robes, known as the loros, were long, jewel-studded bands wrapped elaborately around the body. Gold thread was common. Pearls, sapphires, and garnets were stitched directly into the fabric. To see the emperor was to behold a living icon. Men typically wore long-sleeved tunics belted at the waist with trousers known as braci, a radical departure from the robe-based attire of Rome or Greece. These trousers were warm, flexible, and ideal for horseback riding and combat. Warriors often went shirtless into battle, covered in tattoos or blue war paint made from woad, nod to both intimidation and sacred ritual. Nobles and scholars wore multiple robes atop one another, not just for warmth or beauty, but as a symbol of refinement. The more layers, the more elevated your rank. Jewelry was worn in abundance: thick neck rings called turquoise, bangles, spiral earrings, and amber beads. These items weren't just for show. They marked wealth, tribal role, and sometimes even mystical protection. Hair was another statement. Both men and women braided or coiled their hair, sometimes bleaching it with lime for dramatic effect. Long-styled mustaches and beards were favored by men, especially warriors and chieftains. But to the people who wore it, their clothing wasn't just practical, it was powerfully expressive. Tunics, wool cloaks, and layered furs dominated their wardrobes. Animal hides, often worn as capes or trimmed with teeth and claws, were both status symbols and talismans. Metalwork on belts, clasps, and weapons often featured motifs of wolves, boars, and eagles, creatures believed to hold spiritual power. Though dismissed as uncivilized by Roman historians, these tribal fashions were deeply meaningful. They emphasized mobility, identity, and a spiritual connection to the land and ancestors. In a world of constant migration and warfare, what you wore was your flag, your shield, and your mythology stitched into wool, leather, and bone. Tribal dress reflected warrior culture, kinship, spiritual belief, and a love for bold identity. Where Mediterranean fashion emphasized order and hierarchy, the so-called barbarians leaned into individuality and flair. Peasants, by contrast, wore simple tunics made of hemp or coarse wool, belted at the waist with trousers or leggings. Silk was strictly the domain of the upper class until its production expanded centuries later. Women's attire generally echoed the Hanfu silhouette, with added sashes, flowing skirts, and elaborate hairpins. Hair was always styled with care long and pinned up, often with jade combs, gold ornaments, or floral motifs. The higher and more intricate the hairstyle, the greater the refinement. Hair left loose in public was considered improper for women past childhood. Accessories were laden with meaning. Jade, in particular, was seen as the stone of immortality and virtue. Pendants carved with dragons, phoenixes, or clouds symbolized blessings and moral strength. Even shoes had codes-pointed tips or elevated soles, distinguished the refined from the rustic. In ancient China, fashion was harmony in fabric and form. To Romanize the fashion of Celtic and Germanic tribes was to see wildness, impracticality, and savagery. Let's start with the Celts, spread across Gaul, the British Isles, and parts of Central Europe. Celtic women wore layered dresses or skirts with shawls or cloaks fastened by elaborate brooch called fibulae. Meanwhile, Germanic tribes from the Goths to the Saxons had similar clothing strategies. By the time the Roman Empire evolved into the Byzantine Empire, fashion had become something altogether different, a fusion of Roman authority, Eastern luxury, and Christian symbolism. Color was strictly regulated. Purple, dyed from the rare murex snail, was the exclusive right of the imperial family. Anyone else caught wearing it could face severe punishment. Women's fashion in Byzantium was both opulent and devout. Even outside the palace, fashion mimicked the hierarchy. Before eyeglasses were invented, poor vision was a life sentence, often with serious consequences. Ancient civilizations recognized vision problems, but didn't have the means to fix them. The Greeks and Romans understood eyesight could decline with age. Instead, ancient and medieval readers used reading stones, polished hemispheres of crystal placed directly over text to enlarge it. The true revolution came in the late 13th century in northern Italy, likely in the artisan hubs of Pisa or Venice. It was here that craftsmen began producing the first wearable eyeglasses, turning magnifying lenses from stationary tools into something portable and transformative. These early glasses weren't stylish, but they were revolutionary, so that one could read and do fine work. This places the invention somewhere around the 1280s. Venetian. Glassmakers, already masters of fine crystal, played a key role. Monks could continue copying texts. Doctors could read anatomical diagrams. Artists could keep painting intricate details. Aging no longer meant fading into uselessness. Their work on Murano, an island dedicated to glassmaking, led to clearer, more uniform lenses. The invention of spectacles coincided with the rise of literacy, trade, and urban life. With it, eyeglasses evolved from obscure scholarly tools to everyday commercial goods, accessible, portable, and increasingly practical. These were rudimentary models, simple convex lenses mounted in wire or horn frames, held in place by pinching the nose or tying cords around the head. They weren't comfortable, but they worked for many. By the late 15th century, Venice and Florence also became centers of lens production, combining advances in glass clarity with craftsmanship in frame making. For the first time, their world came into clear focus in decades. For the first time in human history, failing eyesight didn't mean the end of a scholar's or artisan's career. Reading contracts, ledgers, and inventories required good close-up vision. This was the age of Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, men who not only gazed at the stars, but also cracked open the science behind how light and lenses work. Their discoveries forever changed both astronomy and optics, pushing eyeglasses from folk tool to scientific instrument. Presbyopia, still the most common visual issue addressed by spectacles, no longer sidelined older professionals. He was the first to explain how convex and concave lenses corrected vision, differentiating between myopia and hyperopia. For the first time, eyeglass lenses could be understood in terms of precise light refraction, not just trial and error. Buyers would simply try out lenses at market stalls to find one that suited their needs. They weren't just functional. They were evidence of enlightenment, thinking grounded in physics, driven by curiosity and shaped by expanding literacy. No longer confined to the desks of scholars or the toolkits of tradesmen, spectacles found their way into salons, courts, and coffee houses. In their place came temple spectacles glasses, with arms that extended over the ears, similar to what we wear today. Invented around the 1720s, these arms made glasses far more stable and comfortable, especially for everyday use. They were sometimes hinged, sometimes made of flexible wire, and often wrapped in silk or ribbon for extra flair. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on reason and refinement, gave rise to a world where intellect was trendy, and so were the tools that symbolized it. Eyeglasses stood at the intersection of utility and discovery. From now on, improving eyesight would be a matter of science, not just chance. Others applied similar methods to microscopes. These developments turned humble reading lenses into tools for exploring the universe and the invisible. The same glass that helped someone read a book was now helping humans read the stars and the cell. At first, spectacles were a symbol of learning and age. The elite could commission custom spectacles complete with engraving or jeweled accents. While function remained important, form was catching up fast. The profession started to professionalize. Spectacle makers in London, Paris, and Amsterdam began referring to themselves as opticians, a term rooted in science, not just trade. While many were still clunky and nose pinchers, some began to include leather nose pads, riveted hinges, or short handles known as Temple's early attempts to anchor glasses more securely. In China, eyeglasses with looped silk cords tied around the ears were already in use, and Europeans slowly adopted similar innovations. Paintings from the Renaissance often depicted saints, scholars, or apostles in eyeglasses, an emblem of wisdom and spiritual focus. Previously, most glasses only helped farsighted individuals, but as understanding of vision disorders grew, so did the range of corrective options. For the first time, a nearsighted young person could wear glasses to see clearly at a distance, expanding the use of spectacles beyond the elderly and scholarly. But as the middle class embraced them, glasses also became a sign of literacy, professionalism, and commercial savvy. In a world driven by writing and math, eyeglasses became a silent partner in economic expansion. The earliest eyeglasses were convex lenses designed to help with presbyopia, age-related farsightedness, which makes reading up close difficult. These were not mass-produced. Each pair was handcrafted by skilled glassmakers and mounted in simple frames made of wood, bone, leather, or metal. Suddenly, books could be produced by the hundreds and later by the thousands. As printed material flooded Europe, the demand for eyeglasses surged. Literacy rates crept upward, and with them, the need for vision correction. Glasses became more than a scholarly aid. They became tools for the new information age. There were no temples. These lenses were balanced on the nose or pinched together, sometimes held by hand. The earliest written reference comes from 1306, when a Dominican friar named Giordano de Pisa famously told his congregation that it was not yet 20 years since the art of making eyeglasses had been found. It wasn't long before eyeglasses became a quiet but vital tool for monks, copists, and ancient scholars. These early spectacles weren't personalized. There were no eye exams. Buyers simply tested out lenses to see which one helped the most. Glasses were expensive, and illiteracy was still widespread, so their use was limited, but word of their utility traveled quickly. By the early 14th century, eyeglasses had reached Germany, France, and England. A simple tool, two lenses in a frame, had changed the course of human productivity. For the first time, vision loss was not a final chapter. It was a problem with a solution. The concept of nearsightedness, myopia, wasn't fully understood yet, so lenses for distance vision wouldn't appear for another few centuries. Still, the cultural impact was enormous. In a society that valued literacy, learning, and religious scholarship, eyeglasses gave older individuals a second life. The invention spread rapidly across Europe, mostly among clergy and the educated elite. As the 14th and 15th centuries rolled on, eyeglasses moved beyond monasteries and into the bustling hands of Europe's growing middle class. Thanks to the rise of towns and guilds, more people were learning to read, merchants, artisans, and bureaucrats among them. By the 15th century, eyeglasses were being sold by peddlers, apothecaries, and even street vendors. In 1450, Johannes Gutenberg's printing press changed everything. Eyeglass manufacturing began to specialize in Nuremberg, Germany. Spectacle makers formed one of the first dedicated guilds. These early opticians didn't conduct eye exams, but they developed a range of lenses with differing strengths. The role of glasses in social perception also began to shift. Eyeglasses were no longer elite curiosities. They were becoming something more radical, useful, widespread, and essential. The 17th century brought a seismic shift in how people understood vision. It wasn't just about practicality anymore, it was about physics. Johannes Kepler's work in Ad Vitalianem Parallelopomena laid the foundation for modern optics. Meanwhile, Galileo used modified lenses to build the first practical telescope. This new understanding of optics influenced eyeglass makers. With growing knowledge about focal lengths and lens curvature, opticians began crafting more precise corrective lenses. Eyeglass frames also saw subtle improvements. Another major leap was the rise of concave lenses for nearsightedness. By the end of the 1600s, eyeglasses had entered a new era. By the 18th century, eyeglasses had not only become more accessible, they had started to become fashionable. Frame design began to improve dramatically. Gone were the awkward nose-pinched contraptions of the Middle Ages. Materials diversified. Frames were crafted from tortoiseshell, horn, silver, and even gold. Public figures helped normalize glasses. Benjamin Franklin, perhaps the most famous bespectacled man of the era, not only wore them, but Benjamin Franklin didn't just wear glasses, he revolutionized them. In the 1780s, he invented bifocals, cutting two different lenses in half and combining them into one frame, so he wouldn't have to switch between reading and distance glasses. The quizzing glass, a single magnifying lens with a handle, became a fashionable accessory among the upper class, especially in Britain and France. People would wear them on a chain around the neck and use them at social gatherings, less for actual vision correction and more to make a statement of wit, wealth, or curiosity. It was a practical innovation with lasting impact, but a total transformation in how eyeglasses were made, sold, and worn. What had once been artisan-crafted accessories for the few became mass-produced necessities for the many. At the same time, portable eyewear became popular. The classic pince-nez, a nose-clamping style with no temples, was trendy among both intellectuals and fashion-conscious gentlemen. Meanwhile, round wire-rimmed glasses, made famous later by figures like Gandhi and John Lennon, became staples for professionals and students alike. Then came the lorgnette, a pair of spectacles with a handle popular among aristocratic women. But in the 19th century, wearing glasses became a sign of seriousness, education, and rising middle-class respectability. Glasses were practical, but also professional. Glasses were everywhere in classrooms, factories, courtrooms, and newspapers. This was the century where vision met identity, where fashion collided with science, and where spectacles became as personal as fingerprints. By the 1920s and 30s, celluloid and other plastics allowed for bolder frames, giving rise to more expressive eyewear. Later stars like Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Audrey Hepburn wore glasses both on and off screen glasses that emphasized their personality, not their impairments. The military also issued standardized glasses, nicknamed GI glasses, or less affectionately, birth control glasses for soldiers. These weren't flattering, but they were durable and accessible. Thick black rims became associated with confidence and authority. Eyeglasses were no longer something to hide. They were something to show off. Combined with the development of photochromic lenses, which darken in sunlight, glasses became more versatile for everyday wear. It was also the beginning of a technological arms race in optics, one that would define modern eye care. Suddenly, people had a choice. They could wear glasses or not. Whether you were a beat poet in Greenwich Village or a Silicon Valley coder, your glasses said something about who you were. One of the most significant developments has been digital lens crafting. Unlike earlier eras where lenses were molded from preset prescriptions, modern glasses are now shaped with computer-guided precision. As people began spending 8, 10, or even 12 hours a day staring at screens, reports of digital eye strain skyrocketed. Dry eyes, headaches, blurred vision became the new normal. Some frames are now so thin and feather-like that wearers forget they're even on. Modern versions now include audio capabilities, camera integration, fitness tracking, and even heads-up displays. This democratization of access, combined with stylish branding, has turned glasses into a booming e-commerce industry. Companies continue refining the balance between function and style, hoping to make smart glasses an everyday accessory. Others integrate flexible hinges, hypoallergenic coatings, and modular designs for personalization. We're now entering an era where correcting vision is just the beginning, where glasses might enhance human ability, serve as wearable computers, or eventually disappear altogether. Lens companies responded by developing coatings that filter out high-energy blue light, reducing fatigue and improving sleep for some users. Companies like Meta, Apple, and Amazon are racing to develop glasses that integrate seamlessly with augmented reality overlaying digital information, navigation, notifications, translations, even 3D objects onto your field of view, all without taking out a phone. Whether or not the science is conclusive, demand has soared. With liquid crystal or electrochromic technology, these lenses can respond to your gaze, lighting conditions, or visual needs in real time. This allows for customized lenses tailored to exact eye measurements, head tilt, reading distance, and more. Sight had become industrialized, and vision, for the first time in history, was mass-marketed. Bionic eyes, once a science fiction fantasy, are already in development, with retinal implants and brain-computer interfaces, aiming to restore partial vision to the blind. As public education spread and literacy soared, so too did the need for vision correction among school-age kids. The 80s were all about big, bold statements. Think Run DMC and Wall Street executives. Fashion continues to keep glasses relevant, even as they become more high-tech. It's about how the world has come to see us, and how that vision continues to evolve, one lens at a time. Designers blend tradition with futurism. 3D printed frames, recycled materials, modular designs, and customizable colors all keep glasses personal and wearable. As screens became our constant companions on desks, in pockets, even on wrists, our eyes began to pay the price. Eyewear had to evolve once again from medical marvel to fashion staple to high-tech necessity. By the 90s, minimalist styles returned, with rimless and wireframes ruling boardrooms and universities alike. Teachers and parents began recognizing that struggling to read a blackboard or book might not mean laziness. It might just mean nearsightedness. It could be elegantly flicked open and held up for reading or viewing opera performances. In 1862, German ophthalmologist Hermann Snellen created the Snellen chart, the familiar wall chart with rows of shrinking letters revolutionizing how vision was measured. Glass cutting, metal shaping, and lens grinding became faster and more precise. This meant more people could afford glasses, and more could finally see clearly. No longer a quiet sign of aging or infirmity, spectacles had joined the fashion world. You didn't need to visit an optician anymore. Instead, people would test pre-made lenses on their own, trying on different strengths until they found one that worked. While this was far from personalized eye care, it was a giant leap forward in accessibility. They now framed more than eyes. They framed identity. For many, it wasn't just about seeing clearly, it was about being seen. Eyeglasses in the 18th century had become markers of sophistication, intellect, and even flirtation. The 19th century brought spectacles to the masses. With the rise of the Industrial Revolution came not just steam engines in factories. Before industrialization, glasses were mostly made by hand, one pair at a time, but new machinery allowed for consistent production of lenses and frames on a large scale. By the mid-1800s, eyeglasses were available in general stores and even by mail-order catalog. Frame styles also expanded. Steel, nickel, and celluloid and early plastic became popular materials, replacing more expensive horn or tortoiseshell. For the first time, children's eyewear entered the market. Medical understanding of the eye also advanced. Ophthalmology became a formal field, and eye exams began to standardize. Meanwhile, glasses became more acceptable in public. In earlier centuries, many hid their need for spectacles out of embarrassment. By the dawn of the 20th century, the world was clearer than it had ever been. As the 20th century dawned, eyeglasses were no longer just corrective tools. They were a cultural force. In the early 1900s, wire-rimmed glasses remained popular, especially among intellectuals and professionals. But mass production continued to evolve, and with it came new styles, shapes, and materials. Hollywood played a pivotal role. Actors like Harold Lloyd, who wore round horn-rimmed glasses, made spectacles part of his signature look. During World War II, innovation accelerated. Military demand for better optics led to advancements in lens durability, anti-reflective coatings, and lightweight frame design. In 1958, a huge leap occurred: the invention of plastic lenses, lighter and safer than glass. They changed the comfort game entirely. Then came contact lenses. Though invented earlier, it wasn't until the 1950s and 60s that soft contacts became commercially viable. Meanwhile, fashion exploded. The 1960s saw cat-eye frames and mod-inspired colors. The 70s brought oversized aviators. Eyeglasses were no longer just tools for sight. They were statements: politics, intellect, rebellion, style. The 20th century didn't just correct vision. It reframed it. The 21st century brought eyeglasses into a whole new frontier, the digital world. Glasses became smarter, lighter, and more personalized than ever before. Progressive lenses, which offer a seamless blend between near, middle, and far vision, have improved dramatically, eliminating the dizzying distortions that plagued early designs. Another innovation is blue light blocking technology. Frame technology has also leapt forward. Ultralight materials like titanium, memory metal, and carbon fiber made glasses more durable and comfortable. Then came smart glasses. While early attempts like Google Glass had a rocky start, met with both awe and backlash, the concept of augmented eyewear hasn't disappeared. Eyewear retail has changed too. Online platforms now let users upload a selfie, try on frames virtually, and receive prescription lenses without ever entering a store. And let's not forget fashion. From hipster round frames to sleek minimalism to vintage revival, glasses today are expressions of identity more than ever. In the digital age, glasses don't just help you see. They help you filter, protect, compute, and express exactly who you are. As we peer into the future of eyeglasses, the lines between technology, biology, and fashion continue to blur. The future isn't just about seeing better. It's about seeing differently. One of the most promising frontiers is smart eyewear. These devices aim to do what smartphones did for communication: make it instant, invisible, and immersive at the same time. Prescription lenses are getting even more advanced. Some companies are experimenting with adaptive lenses that adjust focal length automatically. No more bifocals, no more switching glasses. Medical technology is also taking bold steps forward. Gene therapies and stem cell treatments for certain types of blindness show promise in early trials. If these technologies mature, eyeglasses might shift from corrective tools to transitional devices, eventually replaced by internal or neural solutions. But the humble eyeglass frame isn't going away just yet. Meanwhile, virtual reality headsets, once bulky and awkward, are slimming down, borrowing heavily from optical science to create immersive experiences in sleek, goggle-like form. These too, in a sense, are spiritual successors of the lens. What started as a monk's reading aid in 13th century Italy has now become a gateway to digital worlds, a medical marvel, and a cultural icon. The story of eyeglasses isn't just about helping us see the world more clearly.